The Sacrament of Flesh. Part 1. Genesis in Blood. The first dove fell from heaven with scissors in its breast. 7 years old, and already the boy understood that mercy required a blade. His small hands, still sticky with communion wine, had found the creature in the cathedral garden, white as forgiveness, cooing its hollow hymns. The scissors belonged to his father, Father Matthias, who kept them in the sacristy beside the golden chalice and the basin of holy water that never quite washed clean. Snip, the sound of wings parting from body. Snip, the geometry of grace dissected. The boy, he had no name then, only the title altar son, arranged the pieces on the stone bench where saints had once rested their weary heads. Feathers bloomed outward like a halo. The body, still warm, formed the cross. The beak pointed toward Golgotha, toward the east, toward the rising of something that was not quite light. His grandfather, Archbishop Dominic, found him there at Vespers. The old man's face was a cathedral itself, flying buttresses of jowl, stained glass eyes refracting violet and amber in the failing sun. He did not scold. He did not gasp. He knelt beside the boy in his crimson robes and whispered, "You see the truth of transubstantiation, child. Flesh is art. Art is flesh, and both require sacrifice." That night, in the dungeon beneath the cathedral, because every cathedral has a dungeon, every heaven its corresponding hell, the boy learned what sacrifice meant. The Archbishop's hands were consecrated. The Father's tongue spoke in liturgical Latin, and the boy's body became the canvas upon which faith painted its most abstract horrors. "This is my body, given for you." The wine tasted like copper. The bread tasted like screaming. Part 2. The Gallery of Thorns. 30 years later, the altar son had become Sebastian Dove, a name he chose for its martyrdom, its penetrated beauty. The art world knew him as a provocateur, a genius who worked in what critics called corporeal surrealism. His sculptures appeared overnight in public squares, human forms twisted into poses of religious ecstasy, skin preserved with such meticulous care that morning commuters swore they saw breath misting from blue lips. In Prague, he left a man on the Charles Bridge, arms outstretched, palms pierced with railroad spikes. A crown of blackthorn branches bit into the scalp, each thorn positioned to miss the skull, but kiss the skin. The blood had been drained and replaced with a clear resin that caught the light like amber, like pressed insects, like prayers suspended in formaldehyde. The police called it murder. Sebastian called it Station of the Cross, number 5. In Florence, she appeared in the Piazza della Signoria at dawn, a woman whose spine had been carefully exposed, vertebrae threaded with silver wire to create a rosary that ran the length of her back. Her hands were folded in supplication. Her face bore the expression of someone who had finally understood the punchline of a cosmic joke. Santa Lucia of the spine, the placard read, "Medium, human tissue, silver, grace." The The art critics wrote essays. The theologians wrote condemnations. The police wrote reports that led nowhere, because Sebastian Dove was always elsewhere, always alibied by gallery owners and patrons who swore he'd been at dinner parties when the sculptures appeared, who testified to his gentle nature, his vegetarian diet, his habit of weeping at sunsets. He was prolific. 2, sometimes 3 pieces per year, each more elaborate than the last, each a prayer in the grammar of mutilation. Part 3, the studio of becoming. Sebastian's studio occupied a converted monastery in the mountains between Austria and Bavaria. The main chapel still held its pews, though he'd replaced the crucifix with a mirror 10 feet tall, Baroque framed, reflecting the space back upon itself, until reality folded into infinite regress. Here, in the nave where monks had once chanted their hours, Sebastian kept his tools, scalpels arranged by size like musical notes on a staff, needles that could thread capillaries, saws that sang in frequencies only the dying could hear. The formaldehyde vats lined the transept. The taxidermy supplies glass eyes in every shade of penitence, wire frameworks that could pose a body in any attitude of worship filled the former confessionals. He worked at night, always. Darkness was the only honest light. His latest subject lay on the altar, still breathing. Shallow, wet respirations. Sebastian had learned to keep them alive as long as possible. Consciousness heightened the art, gave the flesh attention that mere death could never achieve. This one was named Thomas, Doubting Thomas, a philosophy professor who'd made the mistake of accepting a drink at a gallery opening, who'd woken to find himself strapped to marble, Sebastian's face hovering above like a benediction. "Do you know," Sebastian whispered, tracing the scalpel along Thomas's sternum, "that the body is just a metaphor. Skin is the canvas God abandoned. Bones are the architecture of meaning. And blood," he pressed the blade, watched red well up like communion wine. "Blood is the grammar that connects flesh to faith." Thomas tried to speak. The gag prevented words, but his eyes spoke volumes, chapters of terror, verses of incomprehension. "Shhhh," Sebastian soothed. "You're going to be beautiful. You're going to mean something." He began the transformation. Hours dissolved. The body opened like a book, and Sebastian read the text written in muscle and membrane. He extracted the rib cage carefully, preserved the heart in its pericardial sac, positioned the lungs like wings on either side of the spine. By dawn, Thomas had become the anatomy of faith, a sculpture that would appear in Vienna's Stephansplatz, arranged so that morning light would shine through the translucent organs, casting rainbow shadows like a living stained glass window. Perfect, Sebastian breathed, but it wasn't. None of them were. The dread remained that lossless creativity, that void where inspiration should be. He created and created, but the emptiness only grew, a cathedral-sized hunger that no amount of sacrifice could fill. He needed something larger, something final, something that would transform horror into transcendence. Part 4, The Last Supper. It took 9 months to plan, a gestation period, a pregnancy of damnation. Sebastian chose his disciples carefully, not randomly, not impulsively, but with the precision of a casting director assembling a holy tableau. He needed Peter the Rock, a stone mason from Munich with hands like granite and faith to match. Andrew, Peter's brother, a fisherman from the North Sea, still smelling of salt and herring. James the Greater, a construction worker with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of revelation. John the Beloved, a young poet with cheekbones like flying buttresses and eyes that contained universes. Philip, an accountant whose fingers had never created anything but columns of numbers until now. Bartholomew, a butcher who understood flesh in the pedestrian way. Sebastian would teach him the sacred. Matthew, a tax collector turned philanthropist, seeking redemption. Thomas, already transformed, already waiting. James the Lesser, a librarian who'd catalogued every book except the one written in his own veins. Thaddeus, a musician whose hands could make wood sing. Now they would compose in different media. Simon the Zealot, a political radical who'd wanted to change the world through violence. Sebastian showed him a purer path. Judas, this one was hardest to cast. It required someone who would betray themselves, who contained their own contradiction. Sebastian found him in a mirror. The chapel in the abandoned monastery became his workshop. He'd had the long table installed months before 15 feet of solid oak, authentic Renaissance craftsmanship. The chairs were positioned exactly as Da Vinci had painted them. Clusters of 3, the center space left open for the Christ figure. For himself, he worked for 3 weeks straight, no sleep, sustained only by communion wafers and wine stolen from a dozen churches. Each disciple required different techniques. Peter needed to appear solid, immovable, so Sebastian reinforced the skeleton with steel and sealed the skin with a polymer that gave it the texture of worn marble. John required delicacy, transparency, so his flesh was preserved with a crystalline solution that made him seem carved from ice or moonlight. The positioning was crucial. Each figure had to capture the moment of revelation. One of you will betray me, that instant when faith shatters against the rocks of reality. Shock, denial, sorrow, rage, every emotion anatomically encoded in the set of shoulders, the turn of neck, the arrangement of hands. Sebastian worked their jaws open, inserted tongues he'd sculpted from their own tissue. He wanted them to appear caught mid-speech, mid-prayer, mid-scream. Judas, the mirror version, the self-portrait sat at the far end, silver coins spilling from his palm. Sebastian had used his own blood for the paint on those coins, his own hair for the wig, his own face, captured in photographs and painstakingly recreated in a mask of human leather taken from his own thighs. "This is my body," Sebastian whispered as he worked, "given for you." he broke the bread, sourdough, blessed by a priest he'd killed in Bologna, and arranged pieces in the disciples' mouths. He filled their cups with wine mixed with his own blood, drawn fresh each morning in a ritual of self-communion. The scene took shape over days and nights that blurred into a single extended moment of creation. The figures seemed almost alive in the candlelight, seemed ready to speak or weep or rise from their chairs and embrace him. Part 5, the exhibition. On the morning of Easter Sunday, the police found the chapel. Anonymous tip, coordinates, a map drawn in blood on vellum. They entered with weapons drawn, with flashlights cutting the darkness, with prayers on lips that had forgotten how to pray. And there, in the nave of the abandoned monastery, they found the Last Supper, 13 figures arranged around a table. 12 disciples, perfectly preserved, perfectly positioned, wine in their cups, bread in their mouths, expressions of eternal questioning, frozen on faces that had once belonged to missing persons from 8 different countries. And in the center, in the Christ position, arms outstretched in welcome or surrender, Sebastian Dove, still breathing. He'd carved the stigmata into his own palms, threaded thorns through his own scalp, opened his own side with the spear of Longinus, a genuine Roman artifact he'd stolen from a Vatican vault. But he'd done something the original Christ had never managed. He'd survived, barely, hanging by threads of consciousness, suspended between life and the art of death. The lead detective, a woman named Maria, because of course, approached slowly. She'd seen horror before: child murders, war crimes, the usual catalog of human cruelty. But this was different. This was horror that had passed through beauty and emerged as something else entirely, something that made her want to pray and vomit simultaneously. Why, she asked, though she knew he probably couldn't answer. Sebastian's eyes opened, blue as forgiveness, empty as churches at midnight. Because, he whispered, voice like rustling vestments, like pages turning in dead languages, flesh is the only honest medium. Paint lies, stone lies, words especially lie. But blood, he coughed, red staining his lips. Blood tells the truth about what we are. And what are we? Broken, beautiful, both, neither. His smile was beatific. I was trying to create a grammar of grace, a syntax of suffering that would explain. He gestured weakly at the disciples. Why they hurt me, why I hurt them, why God hurts everyone and calls it love. Maria looked at the table, at the meticulous arrangement of bodies, at the bread and wine, at the obscene artistry of it all. You're insane, she said. No, Sebastian corrected. I'm faithful. There's a difference. Part 6, transubstantiation. They took him to the hospital first, then to prison, then to a facility for the criminally insane. The doctors said he wouldn't survive the month. The lawyers said he'd never stand trial. The priests came to offer last rites and left without speaking. Their faith somehow diminished by proximity to his. But Sebastian lived. He lived through surgery and sentencing, through psych evaluations and media circuses, through the auction of his earlier works that made millions for victims' families who didn't want the money, but took it anyway, because what else could they do with grief that large? In his cell, white walls, no windows, a mirror he wasn't allowed, he began to draw. Pencil on paper at first, then charcoal, then whatever he could find. He drew the dove from his childhood, reassembled and flying toward a sun that looked like a wound. He drew his father's hands, his grandfather's smile, the dungeon where he'd learned that love and violation were sometimes spelled the same way. He drew until his fingers bled, until the guards confiscated his materials, until he started using blood from bitten cheeks and split lips to continue the work on the walls. "What are you making?" a psychiatrist asked during one session. Sebastian looked at her with eyes that had seen too far into the structure of things. "I'm making what I was always making," he said. "A map of the human condition, a topography of trauma, a treatise on the transformation of pain into meaning." "That's not what you made," she said gently. "You made corpses. You made victims." "No," he shook his head. "I made art that was honest about what faith does to us, what authority does, what happens when we're taught that suffering is sacred, that abuse from holy hands is somehow different from abuse from profane ones." He leaned forward, intense. "My grandfather said flesh is art. My father said sacrifice is necessary. The church said my body was a temple they could desecrate in God's name. So I learned the lesson they taught me. I learned it so well I became a master of their craft." The psychiatrist wrote notes that would never be read. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Sebastian considered. Outside his window, a bird sang some common sparrow, nothing special. But its song was complex, layered, a fugue of whistles and trills that contained multitudes. "I regret," he said slowly, "that it wasn't enough. That 13 sculptures, even one as perfect as the Last Supper, couldn't fill the space inside me that they created. That hollow place where love should have been." He smiled, and it was the saddest thing the psychiatrist had ever seen. "I thought if I made the horror beautiful, it would stop hurting. But it turns out beauty and horror aren't opposites. They're the same thing from different angles, like bread and flesh, like wine and blood, like faith and the terrible things we do in its name." Part 7, Coda, the dove ascending. Sebastian Dove died in his cell on a Tuesday. No special significance to the day. No symbolic timing. Just another morning when his heart, weakened by wounds and work, finally gave up its rhythms. They found him sitting upright, back against the wall, facing the window where that common sparrow still sang. On the wall above him, drawn in blood and spit, and the dust of ground-up pencil lead, was his final work. A dove in flight, wings spread, body whole and perfect. No scissors in its breast, no laceration. Just a bird ascending toward a sun that looked, if you tilted your head just right, if you allowed metaphor to blur into meaning, almost like redemption. The guards who found him swore that, for just a moment, just before they called it in, they saw the drawing move, saw wings beat, saw the dove break free from the wall and vanish through the window into a sky that stretched forever in every direction. But that was probably just a trick of light, a hallucination born from confronting art that was also atrocity, beauty that was also blasphemy. Probably the body Sebastian's final sculpture, his own flesh and bone, was cremated. No funeral, no mourners. The ashes were scattered in an unmarked location by court order. But sometimes, on Easter mornings, in public squares across Europe, people report finding strange sculptures. Nothing like Sebastian's earlier works, no bodies, no blood, no horror made manifest, just doves, hundreds of them, fashioned from bread and wine, arranged in patterns that suggest flight, ascending toward a heaven that may or may not exist. And if you listen carefully, if you quiet your mind and open the wound-like aperture of your heart, you can hear them singing in frequencies only the faithful and the damned can perceive. A hymn that goes, "This is my body, this is my blood, remember me, forget me. I was here, I was art, I was a child who held scissors to mercy. I was a man who learned to sculpt in flesh. I was broken, I was breaking. I was always both the victim and the sacrament. Amen." In the cathedral where it all began, in the dungeon beneath the altar, a new inscription appears every Easter. No one knows who writes it. The handwriting belongs to a child. It says, "The body remembers what the soul wants to forget." It says, "Faith is the wound, art is the scar." It says, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we never forgive those who trespassed against us." The dove flies, the dove falls, the dove rises again. Somewhere, a boy holds scissors to a bird's breast and hesitates. Somewhere, the blade descends. Somewhere, the blade never descends. All of it is true. None of it is true. This is the sacrament of flesh. This is the transubstantiation we perform on ourselves. This is the art we make of survival. Amen.